Okay, so I am going to begin to kick us off, and I'm sure more people will flow in shortly. So I wanted to, first of all, thank Chanda so much for joining us for this conversation. I'm very excited about it. And what is this conversation? So this conversation is community gatherings and healing spaces in conversation with the Minneapolis Foundation. We really thought it was important today for this track, the CF Insights track, to have a conversation and be more in conversation. You've heard a lot of great data and talk about evaluation and impact investing. And we really wanted to have an impactful conversation about the work. And so before we get into that, who am I talking at you? I am Brian Schultz, pronouns are he, him, his. I am the Director of Partnerships for Candid, overseeing our Midwest region, which includes Minnesota. And so I'm very happy to have the Minneapolis Foundation with us today. And I have been at Candid for over 8 years, but I am new to the partnerships role, so just the first few months. So it's great to see all of you today. And then we, of course, have Chanda Baker with us today, who is the Chief Impact Officer and Senior Vice President of the Minneapolis Foundation. And I'm very excited. I am not going to do the introduction for her because I think she could do it way better than I can. So I'd love to turn it over to you, Chanda. If you can tell us a bit about yourself and your role at the Minneapolis Foundation, and we'll just get right into this conversation.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here today, Brian, and thank you so much for the invitation to talk about our work. I'm Chanda Smith Baker. As mentioned, I've been at the Minneapolis Foundation for 4 years. I came to the foundation after working at Pillsbury United Communities, which is a multi-service organization here in the Twin Cities that operated across the city. And it was an incredibly easy sort of shift and difficult shift at the same time of working on the ground. And I think what I love about the work is sort of the dynamic and shifting nature of the work. Which was very much what I was accustomed to in the work before. And part of what I do at the foundation is probably very similar to what you all understand, leading the impact strategies. I think the thing that might be unique is that I host a podcast there called Conversations with Chanda, and where I talk with guests about what we call gritty issues. Issues of race, issues around policing, issues around education, all kinds of things. Sort of how do we get to the conversations that we normally have in our own communities of comfort? And so that's been quite satisfying to do. And I've led a number of new initiatives and ways to approach philanthropy in my time since I've arrived there. I'm joined today by Brandon Williams, who is our criminal justice fellow and community safety fellow, who works hand in hand with me on the work we're leading in our criminal justice reform area.
Great, thank you so much. I had to find my unmute button. It's like I haven't been on Zoom before. And so to tee us up for our next question, what we're going to talk about today, everyone, is the Fund for Safe Communities that the Minneapolis Foundation has distributed more than $204,000 via microgrants. And so we're going to talk a bit about this fund. And so my first question to kind of tee us off with that conversation is starting from the beginning with the why and the how the fund was established.
Yeah, the Fund for Safe Communities, we actually had a conversation about that today. And so, it was, and, watching the news today where we had another school shooting, it's something that's been really clear in my mind. This fund was actually started after the Parkland shooting in 2017, where our CEO and others were gathered in Florida following that. And they were quite impacted and also looking at the way in which the young people were emerging in their leadership and thought that we should do something. And so there was a donor that seeded this fund with $10,000 and we matched it. So it started with $20,000 and we began to work on it. And I think in 2018 or 2019, Brandon might know, and we can send you the history of it, but we got an infusion of $2 million from a lawsuit in which a family of Justine Ruszczyk had settled with the city of Minneapolis for her murder, a police interaction that resulted in her death. And they settled with what was at the time the highest settlement in history of $20 million. The family directed $2 million into that fund. And so the fund has grown to nearly $5 million. We have put out a little over 2 million. And of that, a portion of it has gone into the micro grants. And so the fund is definitely an area of passion for me. And I think what might better explain it is a short video. If you all might be willing to entertain it for about 5 minutes, I'd love to play that. I think it scopes and frames it quite well.
As a community, we are all grieving still.
When George Floyd happened, a lot of our businesses were looted, burned down, and there's just a whole different feel in Minneapolis now. There's been a spike in violence. I feel like I'm a part of history.
The whole world is watching! A lot of that was figuring out self-healing with what we were going through and understanding who am I, what space do I have, what space do I take up, but also how traumatic that was.
And there was lots of concern about gathering spaces and wellness and trauma being triggered and what were we going to do about it? And I said, I think we should do some micro grants. I like the idea of us creating and having new spaces for people to go. But you know what I love more? Giving resources to people that are already doing work with our young people. I wanted to make sure that every single person on that advisory had some experience directly with violence. And I honestly could not imagine any young person in this city that hasn't. I just honestly can't.
I was invited into this work, I think, because of my experiences with police violence and community violence. My brother was shot by a police officer in 2017, and it was fatal. He was actually shot in his back as he was running away from an officer in Chicago. And a few months later, my mother was shot by a stray bullet. I'm completely heartbroken. I'm completely heartbroken. And I do feel like that I could be some beacon of hope for community because there's so much trauma surrounding us. There's so much violence surrounding us.
In 2011, my cousin Christopher Miller was murdered. He had just graduated from the police academy and he was shot in his back. When it happens to you, you get activated in a different way. You understand it differently. One of the churches called and said, you know, Chanda, we need some resources. We want to get to the young people that are out, that aren't being occupied by things productive. We actually need to have a place where they can just have a game of pickup ball and process in the way that kids process.
It's very powerful. It's very powerful. We actually accepted people in applications from organizations that don't have a 501c3 or a fiscal agent to reach some of the people that we know that aren't reached.
I just don't settle for strategies that aren't true strategies. If we're not talking about radical change, then I have no interest in it.
What I want to see is just a community that values the perspectives of children.
One of my favorite was Sojourner Truth Academy. They utilized plants. You know, they were growing through the pain and the trauma. Sanctuary coming to church. We gave them some funding for a mural. I'm happy that they used the funds in that way and created a space. It's in a prime location, so people pass it and see it. I know Lucy Laney's boxing club came off of, creating a safe outlet to release anger and stress and anxiety. They're gonna take that discipline with them. They're gonna take that resilience.
People come together in positive ways. It helps to ease the pain. I just felt compelled to do something. Well, I knew how to make pies, so that's what we did. Rose McGee, like community mother, right? She is an example of what we want to do with those micro grants. We appreciate the Minneapolis Foundation for knowing that the community needed healing. I absolutely believe that this fund is making a difference.
We need transformational change, and it won't happen overnight.
The one thing that I hope is that violence is not something that we all have to be proximate to before we stop it. Everybody has a way to lead, everyone has a way to contribute, and everyone can make this difference.
That video was powerful. And a few things that really resonated with me was the comment that the lack of interest in strategies that aren't strategies. And I think a lot of foundations, that's a powerful comment for them to hear, and the interest in radical change. And then I just have to say, I loved Rose and her pies. That was great to see funding go to community initiatives like that as well. And so with that in mind, I hope everyone really enjoyed that video. It was quite powerful, very moving. Could you tell us, I know the video showed some of these community events that the micro grants help fund. Could you tell us about some of those? And where would you say that the fund has had the most impact as well? Kind of a twofold big question.
Yeah, for sure. I'll start out and then I'm going to pass it to Brandon. And so my start out is that when here in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, I was in some meetings at the state, and we were leading into the Derek Chauvin trial. And there were lots of conversations around trauma and thinking about how we have places and spaces available for community to come together during a time that we imagine would be quite emotional and quite tense. And the community was worried about over-policing. We knew because of the unrest and the fires and the burning down of property on some of our primarily three of our corridors, there was heightened sort of attention around that in terms of managing community. And so I was in a meeting and they were talking about having a big event in an event center. And I think I got out of that meeting. I called Brandon and Patrice, who's also on the team, and I said, we need to do micro grants. We need to get money to people that are already engaged with community, and we need to do it in 2 weeks before the trial starts. Can you guys do it? and I sent an email to our grant ending team. And so you all know the tensions that, like, you know, pressing on the gas can do. And I pressed the gas. They're used to it at this point. The team was able to execute on it and get it out. And so that was really the point of it, is, you know, not giving it to sort of the main organizations, but giving it to the youth pastors and the basketball coaches and the artists and those folks that already have those connection points to keep people safe and find spaces for them to go. So Brandon, if you don't mind giving a couple more examples, that would be really helpful.
For sure. Thank you, Chanda, for that. I think that there was 3 very powerful examples. The first one being Sojourner Truth Academy, which was already covered in the micro grants by one of our members, Malik. That was really powerful because we had a school, and in fact, one of the teachers at the school said, hey, I have young people coming into school. They're dealing with so many situations at home. How do we talk about these things? How do we come together as a community? And they applied for about $3,000 to create these plants, to talk about during the time where there's so much destruction and getting ahead of this. What ways can we have young people coming together to build something, to talk about life and the beauty in that? Another example was All Square, in which they were focused on the systemic injustice part of it, where it's saying, hey, we had this situation that happened that led to social unrest. We support a lot of convicts and people that are, establishing themselves back into society. They wanted to actually go into the wilderness. So let's get away from the community. Let's get away from these situations. Let's focus on ourselves and talk about, even for us, what are some of the ways we've seen this tension within your lifetime and involvements in the community with law enforcement and things like that? And how do we bring kind of what we focus on for ourselves and our mental health back into the city, back into the work that we do in our lives, and pretty much addressing that with the systemic injustices we see. The last example was Eastside Neighborhood Services, in which their leadership wanted to take a lot of the young youth in the community and saying, hey, this is some of the tension that can happen. We know that we want more direct leadership. We want direct involvement with you all. So let's talk about what's happening. Let's talk about some of the trauma that you face on the east side of Minneapolis, and ways in which we can come together to talk about supporting you all and to get you some counseling, some health services, things that you may not be able to access at home or in your community. So with these micro grants, our goal was about 200 to 250,000, and having that barrier at 2,500 to 5,000, we were able to fund about 57 organizations around that amount. So we had so many organizations that normally wouldn't see this funding because of whatever barrier, that wouldn't be able to submit an application. We allowed video submission. We allowed different ways for them to have access to that. And we saw so much interest in that.
Thank you so much, Brandon.
Yeah, no problem.
So Chanda, this is a little bit off the cuff question, but I know you can handle it. So you talked about pushing on the gas, and for a lot of people, when they think of foundations, they think that the work can be slow, or getting a grant could take up to a year. So can you tell us a little bit about when you decide to push on the gas at your foundation?
I'm looking at Brandon because it's fairly regularly I push, and I do that because, and actually we talked about this today. So if I just sort of recount a little bit of what's happened in our community, which is we had an encampment, a homeless encampment that happened, and it was growing, and there was need in community, and we needed to be in that. It was concerning. It was concerning for them. It wasn't safe. We had a role. There was the Drake fire, where a lot of housing insecure people were living, and families and children. And it was on Christmas Day, and we needed to jump in. We had our first grant. It happened on Christmas Day. Joanna, my staff, delivered a grant check the next day by noon to the Salvation Army. We had, COVID hit. We had first responders in COVID that needed support right away to get PPE equipment and other things out. We didn't have time to write up an application, to be in discussion, to talk about what are the outcomes. We can do that on the back end. And so there are things that are planned, like our annual grant rounds, and there are things that emerge, and we need to be prepared for both. And so we prepare for both. And I think the more I do it, the more the Minneapolis Foundation is familiar with that approach. So it's not, I'm saying pressing on the gas here because I definitely do that. But what I'm actually doing is being responsive to community. What we did with the micro grants is that we are communicating to communities, to community leaders that are unfamiliar with formal philanthropy, that this is a place for you as well, right? That you don't have to be as familiar, because we will help you navigate it in such a way that will build your confidence, that will allow you to get into spaces and other foundations. If your work is there, that we're here to support you in that, because people that know how to navigate it, we know them. They email us, they call us, they want us to meet quarterly, they send us their stuff. They're comfortable. Our job is to find the people that have not traditionally been involved. And so, there's times where I know that I'm doing too much, but I would need someone to articulate, what does that mean in moments of crisis, when people don't have homes, when their children are unstable, when there's a level of trauma that exists. I want you to tell me, what level of inconvenience are you willing to withstand to make them feel more loved by us as a community foundation?
Thank you, Chanda. I think that's so powerful. I think you really push on the fact that a community foundation is the people's foundation, and they should feel comfortable with being able to come to you, or you go to them, as you've been discussing. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the microgrants initiative helped to create healing spaces for the community? I know that some of the examples Brandon talked about touched on that, but if we could go a little more in depth about the creation of healing spaces.
Brandon, you want to take that, or you want me to?
Yep, I can take it. When we talk about in depth, right, and this will go just a little bit to Chanda's previous question. What I love about the approaches that we have, this both and approach of responsiveness and getting ahead of things. And an example I was going to say was last year, right when we established our 2020 Safe Communities grant round, we established that in the spring. So we had that planned out, which was about a 2-month review process, and then a month to get the grants out the door. But then Chanda, she initiated our second grant round, which was in reaction to George Floyd's execution. So that just shows that we have this process where we have a grant round, we have it planned out, but then there's things that arise in the community where then that application process and the preparation for that was very quick, but we all understood the goal and kind of what our vision was for that. And in terms of healing, the micro grants was very much focused on healing, because we were able to say, hey, we've been experiencing this unrest for so long, and then we have this trial coming up, and we hear people, kind of saying, well, this will dictate a lot of what happens in community and the way in which we experience that. The first 2 grant rounds was about, I would say 75 to 80% around violence prevention, but the micro grants, I think that that grant round, about 70% of those applications were strictly around healing. So it was around conversation, it was around community building, where some neighborhood services or some neighborhood organizations said, hey, we want to get our members together. We want to talk about what ways can we support the community, what ways, when we think about the unrest that we've seen, and what ways can we get ahead of that and prepare for that, based upon what we've seen over the year, even, shadowing out to this next, the next case of trials in March, but a heavy amount of that was around pretty much gatherings that allow people to talk to other people in the community that are experiencing these things, and also to get them some wraparound services. So counselors at Shiloh Temple was an example, one of our benchmark churches out here that see a lot of things that happen in the community and have a lot of people going to them. So we're supporting some of that work and that gathering, everything from that to, we had some social workers and psychologists come together and say, hey, what are ways that we can support young people? What are ways that we can invite them into conversations on whether that's at school or in the community, and get them talking about some of the things they're experiencing and ways in which to deal with that and support their family members within the community. So a heavy amount of it was around healing. And as I said, out of the 57 applications, a fair amount of those was strictly around dialogue, conversation, and opening up about the trauma that people experience. I don't know if you had anything to add to that, Chanda.
I think what I would add is that, just like the video said, like, sometimes addressing trauma isn't talking about the trauma, it's giving them an outlet for their emotions, which might be a game of basketball. Like, I think sometimes we overprogram people in community, and this wasn't about overprogramming. It was about creating a space with adults that care, right? And then allowing those conversations to move in the direction that was necessary. And the feedback has been incredible, because what we have is a layered approach here. So we have 3 purposes of the fund that were outlined in the video. And so I can talk about other things. And if you have questions, I'm a really open book. So just, ask away. But it also is about the leaders that are advising the fund. So I want to be very clear that there's 8 advisors that are emerging. They're all leaders of color. They're all roughly under 30. There's not very many dollars that go out of that fund that I don't check on them and their advice. There have been things that I've said no, and they've come back and said yes. And I'm like, okay, let's do it. All of our communities are addressing high surges of violence right now. We've seen the FBI report, it's up by 30%. And I will go out and say, what's happening here, what's happening there. So there's layers of ways in which I'm getting information, in which I'm becoming more proximate, that people are seeing their connection to the foundation. We're being responsive to their needs. They're being responsive to our strategy development. This is mutually beneficial. And it allows for us to grow in our relationship with community, because we're getting closer to the ground. And that therefore informs our strategies for our long-term efforts. And I have found it to be sort of that easy and, and that complex at the same time, I suppose.
Thank you, Chanda. That's really great. And to Chanda's point, we discussed before this presentation started that we're a more casual group. So if you do have questions, feel free to go to Pathable and put them in the chat there. I also think we would be fine if you want to unmic and ask us a question when there is a pause. We'll be able to field that as well. If not, I still have a lot of questions that I'll keep going on. I think this session has been really great and so informative already. So one of my questions, Chanda, is what were some of the lessons that you learned throughout this process? And that can be in regard to the microgrants or just the evolution of the fund as well.
I don't think I thought the microgrants were a big deal. And it's the thing that we get asked about the most. And I just didn't think it was like a thing. So that was a lesson. It was just like, we're responding, we're moving. And I mean, I probably talk about this to some group once a week, or somebody wants to know about it. I also want to say that we talked about that fund being about $5 million. It was started with 20,000. So I know I'm probably jumping ahead, but that $5 million, I talked about the 2 million coming from the family and a settlement, but the other 3 million or so have come from donor advisors that have put money in, corporations and other donors in community, because anyone can put money into the fund. And so the fund continues to grow, and we say any dollar in goes out, and we try to be very responsive in that way and engaging. I hold meetings with our donors to say, if you want to know what's happening in criminal justice reform, what's happening around community safety, we'll do a meeting similar to this size. And I just, we'll pop on, Brandon and I, and answer those questions, because This is a fund that is about the community, caring for the community. And I recognize that what happened here in Minnesota with George Floyd and what's happening across the country and what has been visible by these videos, and what has triggered the emotion and the actions and the insecurity of a lot of companies and a lot of people, that if we don't get to the crux of that, we're not going to be able to have the type of progress that we need. And issues like race are extremely uncomfortable, and there's no way to avoid it when you have something this visible, that clearly kind of comes down to racism and systems that upheld certain practices, and lacks accountability. And so being able to be in that conversation and this body, or with people that don't have it, and to be able to be honest and create a safe space, I think is incredibly important. And for me to bridge what's happening in community, and also understand that there are communities of people that really do care. They might be awkward, there might be some discomfort, but there's discomfort all the way around. And so the intentionality, and I think, Brian, I would have probably built that in versus sort of backing into it. Like all of a sudden I'm like, wait, people are really curious about this. Like I just didn't expect that. And I probably would have built that in. And it was a good lesson for me, because I think about sometimes the relationship, the nature of my role, my mind is that the relationship is community, the foundation. But I don't always think about it in the same way around the work, or the intimacy of explaining the process. I underestimate the importance of that. And that was a big lesson for me. And I think the questions that I received helped me unpack both where it worked and where it didn't work and where we could improve. So I actually depend on that process for that.
Thank you so much, Chanda. I love that you said that you didn't realize people would be so interested in the micro grants. It really tees up my next question on how community foundations can more rapidly mobilize resources to their communities. I think what we hear a lot is some community foundations may say, I only have $20,000 for the arts or for this. But I think what you showed in these micro grants is that they can really go a long way. And maybe people's traditional thoughts of what the arts are or what something else is can be different. It can be music in the park. And so I really love that. And so that question again, now that I've kind of grandstanded, I'll go on the question on how can community foundations more rapidly mobilize resources? And I think that's open. How can anyone more rapidly mobilize resources to their community?
But first, you have to believe that you can rapidly mobilize resources, right? Like there has to be a belief system that you can do that. And I think leadership around that matters. We also created, so this fund was created in 2017. We did not know that this was going to happen in our community. We also created this one Minneapolis fund, which is also a responsive fund. And that started with $1 million that we seeded. And that also was a co-investment model with our donor advisors and broader partners that can invest into that fund. And that's raised nearly $7 million. And so between these two funds, that's $12 million in a short amount of time that we have mobilized from the community that wasn't part of this portfolio before 2017. And I think that's quite remarkable. And I think what I would add to this is in terms of the question, which I think you're getting to, is around success. It depends on where your bar is. If you're at the move the needle, I'm not the move the needle type. That's not me. And the reason why it's not me is because I feel really, So first, I have 5 kids. I can't move the needle with all 5 of them in the same way. So I can appreciate multiple approaches to things, but I also know that we have a long entangled history here. And I don't think we're going to be able to untangle it in a grant round. I don't think we'll be able to do population level change in a grant round in a year, right? I just fundamentally don't believe that, but I believe we can have a lot of impact. So with a micro grant, we are shaping the brand of the foundation and making it more accessible. We are diversifying who we fund. We are adjusting our systems and removing barriers to make us more inclusive. We are developing leadership in our advisors and introducing them to organizations and community in ways that we help support the development in their leadership long-term in this community. There are so many things that are happening in this fund that are of benefit. And I think that when you look at it from a linear point of view, you miss sort of the magic of it coming together. And yes, we're still looking at sort of the overall benefit, and we're being creative about how we're looking at evaluation. So I'm not being dismissive, but I think if your point of view is, did education change as a matter of our micro grants, or did mental health issues go away? No, they did not. But are we creating space, and are we helping to support a dialogue around diagnosed mental illness, depression, mental health are things that have to be taken care of as a matter of life. It should not be a shameful thing to do. It should be something that is built into your experiences of life for self-care, and we can build that in. And if we do that successfully as a contributor to that, then hopefully we see the downturn with some of the issues that we see. So I just want to sort of point that out, and that by being in continued relationship with people, some of the stories of our work aren't even told by us. They're being told by other leaders in the community. And that helps mobilize resources for us that we haven't anticipated, because the community is telling the story for us.
That's really powerful. Thank you so much, Chanda. And just to tee it up for everyone, we will be taking questions very shortly after this question. So please think about your questions that you have for Chanda and Brandon. And I think you kind of answered this question on how, or no, maybe not. Do you think that other community foundations or communities can replicate this initiative? Is it replicable? Or do you think that depends really on their community?
I think you can replicate it. Like technically you can replicate, right? Like technically it's a fund, right? You know how to open up funds, right? It wasn't $250,000, grants between $3,000 or $2,000 and $5,000, low barrier, you get them out. Politically, like, will the leadership go for it? Will the board go for it? Like, there's some navigation there. You know, the appetite for what might be riskier, and whether or not that sits there. And then relationally, you know, your relationship with community. And so I imagine that there are people that are closer to community in the community foundations, right? We all care for community, but there are people that have deeper sort of tentacles into community. And I think utilizing those folks to establish trust and making sure community understands that it's for them. And I'm using that word very broadly, but the communities that you're targeting understand that those resources are available for them. I think are important. And, you know, this fund, by the way, was not without community pushback at one point. As I mentioned, for those of you that were here with the opening, that $2 million of the dollars came from a city settlement for a woman, Justine Rushtek, that was killed by the police. And folks in community were like, yo, why are you taking that money? And so they were like not happy. Brandon was working here and he wasn't happy, right? And it's fine. It's fine for you not to be happy. It's okay. I'll embrace it. And we're going to take that money and we're going to do good by it. And so it's, you know, I'm fine kind of weathering the storm of things, and that's not going to be the story of everyone. But when you sort of get into community and onto the ground, sometimes it can be noisy and sometimes it can be uncomfortable, and you have to have some tolerance for that. And I happen to have a high degree of tolerance for it, because that is the work, working through the pain, working through the problems to get to the other side. So I'm comfortable in that space.
Thank you, Chanda. I feel like this is Real Talk with Chanda, and now I need to binge your podcast series because
yes, please.
I'm loving this. So on that note, does anyone have questions for us? I don't think I am seeing any in Pathable, but if you want to unmute and ask a question, I think we would all be game for that.
Hi.
It's going to take us, Julieta. Yes, Julieta with our first question.
Yes, hi. Thank you for this great conversation. So Chanda, I definitely appreciate and understand, that you're looking at these challenges and issues from a nonlinear approach. And I'm really curious to know, how does the foundation measure change or evaluate change and impact? In this case, do you have either a model or, trying to step away from very linear language, do you have best practices that you use? And I'm asking this because I think that there are a lot of foundations, a lot of nonprofits that are trying to take on more kind of holistic approaches to their work, but we're still kind of hitting that the challenge of, like, how do you measure that, right? How do you talk about your impact in that situation? So what do you have any recommendations?
I mean, it's a dicey one. I mean, I think I mentioned, I push back all the time on those type of questions. And I also recognize that it's important. And I push back on it because I don't let evaluation drive the work. That's a period. I just don't. And I know the work is impactful, right? And I know that we have to be able to prove it. And some of the impact reporting question comes down to trust, because I watch large amount of monies go to some anchor institutions in our cities and no one asked the question. So I want to understand the difference. And I want to understand the difference. So I push there. And then I also, again, as I said, it depends on where you want to see impact. And so we've been working with a group to sort of help me articulate the impact broadly in a stronger way. And some of that is actually breaking the mold of what's sort of been there. And that's what we're doing right now. And so once we finish working, and we're working with them now, I will be happy to share that out. But in this fund, there's micro grants. We also funded pretty substantially some work with NYU, the policing project. I'm working very closely with Barry Friedman there on systems change work and reimagining community safety. I sit on the national table. We funded a police deadly force working group out of there. So success in that case was a recommendation that came out in March of 2020. So this predates the May murder of George Floyd. There were 61 policy recommendations. Within 1 year, we had moved about 25 of those policy recommendations. We secured another $3.5 million from another partner in philanthropy to execute on some additional recommendations. That's success. And to be able to say, we will move on 21 to 32 policies, including, hopefully, no active white supremacists can be police officers in the state of Minnesota. right, to get a registry of police that are involved in deadly encounters, to have police officers have a psych test other than their employment year. And after deadly encounters, that it becomes part of what they do every 3 years to make sure that their mental health is strong, because they're encountering our community's most vulnerable people. And so I think that's success. So in that case, that's what I would measure it. And so I don't have sort of a scaled answer, but in the initiatives that we do, we look at what are we trying to measure. And then I share that on the front end, and I'm able to demonstrate it and talk back with groups. And a lot of times I think what they want is to be in the conversation and know that their dollars matter. And I think I can make a case for it being, for it to matter, that they matter.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else have a question? And feel free, I'm checking Passable if you'd rather type in your question there.
I could jump in, Brian.
Okay.
This is, Dave Rosado. So you mentioned earlier, Chanda, about, so there's, of course, a lot of the interest that you got in the microgrants program. And you mentioned also donor advisors and how they became interested in co-investing in that fund with you. And so I was sort of curious to know what, if any, sort of outreach went into that piece of it, if donor advisors were themselves proactive about expressing their interest in co-investing with you. I just wanted to know kind of just what the process was to getting them involved in this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was multiple ways, David. So there's our philanthropic advisors that when fund holders were contacting them and saying, I really want to be involved in issues of policing or reform, we had a response available for them. Now, mind you, this was created before. So we had people that were coming into this fund a little bit before, but we were ready with a solution when this happened. And so people were able to be engaged. We also have a fair number of corporate partners that have put money into this fund. And again, corporations called and we were able to answer. And then in some cases, we were proactive, like this video was a proactive measure to say, here's where the money went and we need more money. Right. And so it's sort of both, but we're just continuing to be involved. The Timberwolves and the Lynx, you may have seen them at the end of the video. For those that have seen it, they've reached out to us. They've been very active in their partnership. And they don't advise on the fund in the same way that our emerging leaders do, but we certainly have lots of conversations with them, talk with the players, work with them. And there's lots of folks that want to be in the fund because they want to understand the issue. And I think that's the piece, is that it's not a transactional fund. It is a fund that's based on resources, deepening their understanding of the issues around race, their issues around community policing and community safety. And it's the combination of all of those things that allows for an engagement of investment to happen and allows for people to enter the conversation and therefore enter the fund in multiple ways, pathways.
Thank you for that. That's great.
Yeah, I love the phrase, not a transactional fund. And I feel like we don't hear that enough, that these funds aren't all just transactional. Does anyone else have a question? And I also want to make sure, Chanda, that there were a few comments early on. Someone said, thank you for sharing the video and your story. Someone said, video grant applications, love that idea. And then there's another comment that said to get a check cut in 24 hours is very impressive in itself.
That was my comment. I'm inspired by the culture that you've created within the organization to not just make decisions in that way, but to all come together to actually take action. So that's all.
I mean, I can share another example. We had a high profile murder that happened here with a gang member, right? And there was going to be a funeral and the family wanted a procession and they were going down the neighborhood. And we did not want to instigate sort of the energy by having it be over policed. But we knew we needed to do something, so we needed to have some community interrupters be engaged with it. And I mean, I was on vacation, the mayor called, other people called, I called the team. I think it was Thursday or Friday, the funeral was the next day. We were able to say yes. I sent a note out to Brandon, to the advisors, is this something that we should be supporting them in, so that they know they have resources coming, so they can pay the community folks to come out? And they said yes. I called the finance people, can you have a check cut on Monday? And they said yes. And I think that the more I do it, the more we do it, it is creating more comfort.
Yeah, I think that's another part that can hold us back from progress or creating space, like you said, because our systems aren't set up to be agile either sometimes in our sector. So I'm just really inspired by hearing the work that you're doing, and I know why everyone's calling you. So I'm grateful that we got some of you today.
Thank you. I mean, none of our systems are agile, and that's part of the problem, right? Like, I have 5 kids, none of them are morning kids, right? Like, schools all start in the morning because people want to be done at 3:30 or 4 o'clock or whatever it is. And it doesn't actually work for every kid. And, the question of who is it convenient for is a really important question. And I think it's up to us to really push and ask, like, not push for push sake, but like, what are the rhythms of community, and what are our rhythms, and where is it not overlapping? Because that's where I think the sweet spot is. And it could be with granting. Like what this fund has allowed for us to do is lean into the leadership around these issues of community safety and police violence and systems change. It's created a vehicle for leadership. Granting itself is not the end.
Right.
It's just one vehicle that allows us to lead. And I don't think, in my role, I don't think grants are the catalyst, but it's not the beginning and the end of the conversation for me in any of the portfolios that we have. If we're not leading there, I'm not sure we should be granting there.
You can unpin me in a second, Brian, but it gets me thinking about the individual philanthropic piece of it. It sounds like you've had some individual contributions, and it just gets me thinking about, different ways to give. And this is a really exciting solution for individuals that want to make an impact in a different way outside of the kind of traditional philanthropy structure as well. So I'm excited to figure out how to teach more of our folks what you're doing in that way too.
And it's been silo busting within the foundation, right? And so that could be successful, right? I mean, that's success, right? So.
And with 4 minutes to go, Brandon, I want to make sure if you have any comments or anything this conversation has come to light that you'd like to additionally add as well, that we give you time to do that.
The first thing is just, I'm always appreciative of Chanda because, as I said, I've started here right after graduating college, and my passion was going into law. And I think being here at the foundation and kind of, Chanda leading this work that we do, there's so many things that I see that I wouldn't have realized or noticed outside of my own field, right? When we talk about video submissions, I know we kind of graze over that quickly, or accepting applications from people who didn't have a 501c3, or they didn't have a fiscal sponsor, but they were able to sign a contract. Like that's kind of mind blowing to me. And when I talked to some of our members about that, and we were talking about, should we do this or not? Some of them even wondered, was it possible? Like, how do we do that? How do we get money to a basketball coach who literally picks up kids from their house, takes them to the field or takes them to the court or takes them to the field, or we talk about baseball, whatever sport there is, without any funding, any help from a school, from the community, right? And they do all this work by themselves. How do we get them funding? Because they're doing that immediate boots on the ground work. It's really innovative. And then as a foundation, when Chanda talked about those resources, right? Like we have that passion and she have a big trust that the resources in the system will follow that. So then how do we build out a grant application like that? How do we set up this process for a paper submission, but also a video submission? And how do we, prioritize things like, is grammar a big thing? Is innovation a big thing? Like, how do we remove a lot of those barriers that will restrict people who's doing very immediate work and that would normally restrict them? How do we give them that access? That's just the biggest thing to me as a younger person, being the youngest person at the foundation, actually. It's just really exciting to have someone say, hey, Brandon, you've lived in a shelter, or you've been in a community, you played sports, you've been in these situations so much. What do you think? What do other people like you think when these situations happen? So I'm very appreciative of that and to be able to be involved in this work with Chanda and the rest of our team. I brag about her a lot, so I haven't bragged enough until now. So I'm really appreciative of it.
Thanks, Brandon. I think what you said was really powerful because a lot of times people get that stuck in like, how can we give to someone who's not a 501c3? Or yeah, what about the grammar, all the character limits? And it does stop people. There are boundaries that we put up, sometimes purposely and sometimes by accident. And so I think that's really powerful. And Chanda, we only have 2 minutes left. I told myself this session was going to be amazing, and I personally think it was. And so with that in mind too, everyone, I was supposed to remind you that in the poll section on Pathable, you can rate this. I wouldn't expect it to get anything less than 5 stars, but I'm biased, obviously. But feel free to go and rate it there. But Chanda, do you have anything you'd like to leave us with? We have a minute now, so in a minute to kind of leave us with any words. And thank you so much.
Yeah, look, I'm excited about the work. This fund for me is about, innovation. And it is about our learning as much as it is about creating access. And I think we all have ways to do that, whether or not it's through granting or whether or not it's your convening strategy or whatever it is. For me, it brings me energy. And we are in a moment in a time where we need to find work that we feel passionate about and energized by. And there are so many restrictions. We live in them. We know how frustrating it is for us. And so it's like, how do we remove them as much as possible for others and just find, just one little sweet spot that just feels disruptive enough to bring energy to like deal with the other mess that you have to muddle through. And so, hopefully I've inspired in that way. And if there's anything that anybody at the Minneapolis Foundation can do to be supportive in your disruption, just let us know.
Thank you so much. A big thank you to Brandon and Chanda. I think this was an amazing session. And I also want to remind everyone that there is a CF Insights networking session after this as well. So if you want to get your network on, please head over there. But again, Chanda and Brandon, thank you so much for being here. That video was super powerful as well. I am sure to share it with others.